Alright, I guess I'll do one of my more classy videos, because in the comment section of one of my videos, someone was like, if you like communism so much, why don't you move to China? And then someone else corrected them by saying that China is becoming more and more of a free market every day. So, in fact, you would not go to China because they're giving in to capitalism. And they're both right, but not in the way they think. So, I've made this chart of how capitalism works. In fact, how all economic policy works. The thing about libertarians and capitalist sympathizers and stuff is that they say they want less government. But what they really mean is they want more to be governed and less to be in charge of the governing. That's really what capitalism comes down to, is either the power of the few or the power of the many. The closer you get to capitalism, the less people are in charge but have more power within those that are. It condenses the power. It condenses the class struggle. And as you switch toward the left, you start to, redistribute the wealth. You redistribute the power. And it becomes more even-steven. So, here's the chart. I know it's kind of blurry. My camera is not that great. But what you see here is a crown at the top. That was what capitalism used to be before the Industrial Revolution. Monarchy, feudalism. The idea was that one royal figure basically owned everything, and because of the church was backing him up on it, and the people were ignorant and weak, starving, they just cooperated with it. The idea was that the king knew best, and that the king came from divine background. Most royalties actually believed that they had a godlike bloodlines or something. And the point was, the king could not really run everything himself. That would be impossible. One man is not omnipresent. But what he did was, he essentially was the final authority. Kind of like moderators. How you have moderators typically as like the dukes, the people who own sectors of land. Let's use 4chan for example, and Meta board has a duke, New board has a duke, V board has a duke, things like that. And then Sti is like the monarch. Sti is the king, and ultimately when the dukes cannot figure out things for themselves, they go to the king. But most often, since it's such a consolidated form of power, they don't have those kinds of conflicts, because what is it, like 5-6 people in charge? So arguments are not going to come up, a civil war is not going to arise, and that's what capitalists want. They want consolidated power, because then they'll say, oh, that's peace, oh, that's less government. No, that just means that everything is more rigid and more stagnant. Then we move on to, well, actually I should have drawn a second variant going to this, but essentially I was going to point out corporatism. Corporatism is when the corporations run the government as opposed to the government running the corporations. This is could also be called plutocracy. Plutocracy, and some people actually believe this shit. Some people actually think the rich know best, and that people with money and who are well off, successful for whatever reason, are more inclined to make wise decisions than the poor. And that's fucking ridiculous. Wealth has nothing to do with how competent you are, how intelligent you are, or how compassionate you are. Quite the opposite. Have you look at Jersey Shore, look at the Kardashians. Would you say those people are equipped to vote on anything? And that is not abnormal for rich people. Rich people are out of touch with reality because they think the whole world is like their lives, kind of like Mr. Reb Zion. So the point here is that in corporatocracies, essentially capitalists compete to control the law. And they use bribery, they use lobbying, which is just another form of bribery, and they use all these twists and turns, contract laws and shit, to try and compel government to act in accordance to their will, as opposed to them acting in accordance to government's will. Which is what you see now. That's why big businesses get away with fucking murder. But you cannot get away with smuggling a little pot in your pocket. That's because we live in corporatism. The reason why I would have probably wanted to list a variant is because we started out practically corporatist with our democratic republic. The fact that we had such a rigid class hierarchy by having the state representative branch, the Senate branch, the president, the Supreme Court, the governors, who all acted like monarchs in their own state, it was just a more complex, more clusterfuck version of the monarchy. Because guess what? The governors could do whatever they wanted, but at the same time, they were held somewhat accountable to the federal government. And the federal government had this large body of representatives, of senators, of chancellors, essentially, that dictated everything. And that's why we had the Civil War. Because governors didn't like the fact that they weren't real monarchs, and that they couldn't get all the benefits of coal, slavery, oil, gold, and so that's why they waged the bloody Civil War. But it didn't plan out for them, obviously. But that's essentially what it was. Even though it was a much more complex, much more in-depth system than monarchies of old, it was still class hierarchy. It was still class struggle, and it was still basically a dictatorship. It was just the dictatorship of a few more than just a royal bloodline. So then we move on to fascism, or Nazism, whatever you want to call it. The difference between fascism and socialism is essentially either the state accepts private property or it doesn't. And fascism accepts private property because fascism believes some of the lies typically spouted by capitalism, that competition is good, conflict is good, it benefits evolution, zig meow, things like that. That's the kind of thing fascism advocates. If you actually read some of Mussolini's work, he says that outright, that the reason the economy needs to be controlled is so that essentially it's controlled chaos. The fact that he wanted to make it to where everyone was simultaneously competing, and that's why he spent most of his time worrying about warfare. Because he believed that warfare was the general direction of evolving humanity. He believed that death and destruction forced us to get up off our asses and think about how we were going to survive and how we were going to build better technology, and in some regards he may have been right. But was it the moral option? Was it the righteous option? We will never know, because now we're not allowed to talk about this legitimately. And the fact that fascism has become this all-encompassing Saturday cartoon villain. It's like some fucking Saturday morning cartoon, and just everything evil we associate with fascism without understanding the implications of it or why we considered it evil to begin with. But knowing all of that, would I say that fascism is less governance than other forms of capitalism? Well, of course I would, because it involves direct government intervention on private capital. But we come to the same problems as with monarchies and things like that. What you essentially have is dukes, controlling your personal life in the everyday sense, and then when something goes wrong, they run toward the fascist government to have the answers. It's the same it's the same shit. It's just more in depth, it's just more of the same, it's just a bigger group of people acting as as opposed to a smaller group. So clearly we haven't come that far. Then we move on to what China is. China is a state socialism, or at least that's what it pretends to be. As a state socialism, the state directly controls the capital. It doesn't just pick the winners and losers. It doesn't intervene to such an extent that it controls your personal decisions by taxing the hell out of cigarettes or, subsidizing corn or whatever. It directly controls circulation by saying you produce this much and you don't produce that much, etc. And that's actually less dictatorial than all the other ones, because it takes more people involved in the state to run that kind of economy. And that's why people that live in socialist countries tend to be a lot better off, not just physically, but mentally, than in the previous incarnations. But you won't hear that on the news, you won't hear these dumb rednecks online saying that, but that's essentially what it comes down to. By there being more government, there is less people governed. And this is just a subvariant of what we could have, but have not given enough thought to do as a variant, and that is a union of unions. This is how I interpret Vladimir Lenin's Vanguard Party. I interpreted his vanguardism as we have this structure where there are a multitude of powerful unions simultaneously controlling the means of production. This might deviate toward fascism in some regards, but not quite, because fascism was one encompassing state body dictating the course of production. And while this is a group of unions, all separate, like I could draw here Union 1, Union 2, Union 3, Union 4, you get what I'm saying. And each union would control a subsector of the market. Let's say Union 1 controlled the water supply, Union 2 controlled the food supply and agriculture, Union 3 controlled entertainment and education, that sort of thing. By all simultaneously controlling a very large sector of production, there would be no way for anyone to be intimidated or coerced into a position they do not like, because it would cause civil war. It's sort of like how fascism wants to cause war, but at the same time it doesn't want to cause war. It doesn't actually want to kill people, but it wants to scare people. It wants to scare people into not going down that road. It's almost like a perpetual Cold War. And I've never seen that done before. Maybe it has, and I just don't know about it. But I interpret the vanguardism to be that, where we would have several powerful unions that all control the private sector, and it's no longer private because obviously there's no few in charge. It's a group, it's a commune. It's just several communes going on at once. And these several communes are not really competing, but in theory they could compete if for whatever social reason they're pissed off at one another. And I believe in this state, we would slowly integrate into pure communism. And a lot of communists believe that our state socialism, which we are all too familiar with, will naturally integrate us into pure communism too. And what is pure communism? Well, it's just all of the people, all of the time, controlling the means of production. No one is governed. No one is forced to get a job they don't like. No one is forced to live a life that isn't theirs. They are just people. People that produce, people that are happy, people that live a very long time. And that's what it comes down to. The fact that when I go out there into the world to get a job, it is not the market competing to hire me. It is myself and people like me competing to get hired. We are competing for barely any wage at all because we need something. And we always have to set our standards lower and lower and lower because we need to survive, and they fucking know that. That is evil. That is despicable. But at no point do the capital owners ever have to compete to keep their power structure. At no point do they compete to get the labors of people like me. They get to make all the rules. They get to make all the assumptions. They get to have everything. And I get nothing. And many people like me get nothing. And there are more people getting nothing than getting something or everything. That's why we have the expression, the 1% and the 99%. While the math may not be that simplistic, the principle is the same. A very few people get to make all the decisions and have all of the benefits of what capital has produced, and the vast majority do not. And that is wrong. Why are you supporting that? Because you are not the 1%. You are not benefiting from capitalism. You are not in charge of how the capital works. Why the fuck are you supporting capitalism? And the more conservative you claim to be, the more on this scale upward you go instead of downward. And it's only to your benefit to go downward. And right now, in America, we're somewhere between fascism and corporatism. And I would say we lean much more toward corporatism, but the Tea Party and the like seems to think we're more toward fascism. But whatever. The point was that neither one of those is really beneficiary to the middle class or to the poorer classes. If we really want to see some actual substantial change, we need to move toward vanguardism or state socialism, and communism is not foreseeable in the near future because it's a transitional thing. You don't get from point A to point D in a matter of years. It takes a long time. And so you have to go down the ladder. If you don't go down the ladder, it's just going to destabilize everything. So that's my interpretation of how economics works, how economic policy works, how it affects society, and how we can say that China is a communist state and a socialist state and a capitalist state all at the same time without actually thinking about what those words mean or the implications they have. China is not a free market state, but at the same time it is by no means a communist state or attempting to be a communist state. So hopefully you learned a little something, hopefully it makes you think about some stuff. See you later.